If you're honest, there was a time when living felt like maintenance. Keeping things together, staying ahead, making sure nothing slipped. Even when life looked calm, something in you stayed engaged, watching, adjusting, correcting. And then one day, without effort, you noticed something subtle. You stopped managing, not because you gave up, but because life didn't need it anymore. Stay with me until the very end, because what you'll recognize then is why life moves best when you stop trying to move it. For most of your life, being responsible meant being involved, not just present, involved. You stayed mentally close to everything: your decisions, your relationships, your work, your inner state. You didn't let things simply be. You tracked them. You checked in on them. You made sure they were okay. And this vigilance felt normal, necessary even, because somewhere early on, you learned that if you didn't stay attentive, something would drift, something would break, something would fall behind, something would get out of control. So awareness slowly turned into supervision. You didn't call it control, you called it being conscious, being prepared, being mature. But there is a difference between awareness and management. Awareness witnesses, management interferes, and most people live their lives slightly interfering with everything. You interfered with your emotions. If sadness appeared, you questioned it. If calm appeared, you monitored it. If joy appeared, you wondered how long it would last. You interfered with time. You rushed moments that felt uncertain. You slowed moments that felt too good. You leaned forward into the future constantly. You interfered with yourself, correcting your reactions, adjusting your tone, second-guessing your instincts, not aggressively, subtly, continuously. What if the exhaustion you once felt was not from living, but from quietly supervising your own existence? This supervision was not loud. It didn't feel like anxiety. It felt like care, like responsibility, like being someone who has it together. But supervision carries a hidden message. Life cannot be trusted to move on its own. And when that belief is active, rest never fully arrives, because something is always being watched. Even in moments of stillness, part of you stayed alert, a background process running quietly. Is this okay? Should I be doing something? Am I missing something? This is not overthinking, it's overholding, holding yourself in place, holding life in shape, holding the future together with attention alone. And attention, when used this way, becomes effort, not dramatic effort, but constant, the kind that drains slowly, the kind that leaves you tired without knowing why. This is why so many people felt exhausted even when their life worked, because life was functioning, but it wasn't trusted. And anything that isn't trusted has to be managed. The shift that begins a life that moves on its own is almost invisible. You don't decide it. You don't declare it. You notice it. You realize that something happened without your involvement. A problem resolved itself. A conversation softened naturally. A decision landed without debate. And your body didn't tense. Your mind didn't rush in. You let it stand. At first, this can feel strange, because letting something stand without revisiting it used to feel irresponsible. But nothing collapses. Life doesn't punish you. Things continue. And something inside you, this is the moment control quietly steps aside, not because you reject it, but because it becomes unnecessary. You don't stop caring, you stop hovering. A life that moves on its own is not chaotic. It is self-organizing, just like your breath, just like your heartbeat, just like sleep arriving when vigilance fades. These systems do not require supervision, they require permission. When identity integrates, life begins to feel less fragile. You stop assuming it needs your constant input. You stop bracing for error. You trust sequence. Not because you know what will happen, but because you are no longer afraid of what might. This trust does not come from optimism. It comes from familiarity. You've watched life move correctly enough times now to stop interrupting it. You may notice something important here. When life starts moving on its own, you don't disappear. You become available. Available to respond. Available to participate. Available to act when action arises, not when fear demands involvement. This is where action becomes cleaner. Decisions feel simpler. Time feels less aggressive. Because nothing is being forced into alignment. Alignment is assumed. You might notice that silence grows. Not empty silence, but unoccupied silence. The kind that doesn't demand explanation. The kind that doesn't need to be filled with improvement. Pause here with me. If you recognize this shift, this sense that life no longer needs your grip, leave a simple declaration in the comments. I let life move. Then let's continue. There is a subtle shift that happens when life no longer needs supervision. Action still happens, decisions are still made, words are still spoken, movement continues. But something essential is missing: ownership. Not responsibility, ownership. You no longer feel like the author trying to hold the story together. Action stops being personal. For a long time, action felt like effort because it carried identity. If you acted and it worked, it said something about you. If you acted and it didn't, it said something else. So every movement had weight. Every decision carried implication. And implication creates tension. What if action only felt heavy because it was never meant to carry your identity? When identity integrates, action becomes anonymous. Not invisible, anonymous. It arises, it happens, it completes, and then it dissolves. You don't hold on to it, you don't replay it, you don't build a narrative around it, you don't ask what it means about you. This is why action begins to feel lighter, not because you do less, but because nothing is being proven. You are not confirming worth through motion, you are responding to life. Think about how your body moves. You don't claim ownership of swallowing. You don't evaluate the meaning of blinking. You don't attach identity to standing up. Movement happens because conditions are present. Action in an integrated life begins to feel the same. You may notice this at work. You do what needs to be done without internal commentary. You don't ask if you're doing enough. You don't hover over results. You finish and move on. This doesn't make you careless, it makes you accurate. Ownership always required vigilance. If something is mine, it must be protected, defended, reviewed. But when action no longer belongs to you, it no longer needs defense. This is where mistakes lose their sting. Because a mistake is no longer a reflection, it's information. And information does not threaten identity. You may notice now that you stop rehearsing action beforehand. You don't plan conversations internally as much. You don't script responses. You let interaction unfold. And often, it unfolds better than anything you could have managed. This is not because you became passive, it's because you stopped interfering. Interference was never intelligence. It was fear disguised as preparation. When action happens without ownership, timing improves. Not magically, naturally. You speak when there is space. You move when momentum is present. You pause when things are complete. And because there is no urgency to be someone, you don't rush the sequence. This is how life begins to move on its own, not because nothing happens, but because nothing is being dragged. You may also notice that emotional charge drops. You don't over-celebrate success. You don't dramatize failure. You allow both to pass through, because neither defines you anymore. Neville spoke of action following assumption. When the assumption is integrated, action does not need intention. It expresses itself. This is why effort disappears without productivity disappearing. Effort was the friction between identity and movement. Once identity settles, movement becomes smooth. You begin to trust that things will be handled even when you are not handling them. And this trust is not blind, it is experiential. You have watched life carry itself again and again. You may notice something deeply calming now. There is less to remember, less to track, less to manage. Your attention returns to the present moment because it is no longer needed elsewhere. This is when participation replaces control. You are here for what appears. You are not guarding the rest. And life feels responsive, alive. For a long time, time felt like something you had to aim. You pointed yourself toward it, you managed it, you tried to stay ahead of it. Time was not neutral, it felt evaluative. If you were on track, you relaxed. If you weren't, tension appeared. So you kept checking, not the clock, your position. Where am I relative to where I should be? Am I behind? Am I wasting something? This constant orientation made time feel aggressive. What if time only felt heavy because it was never meant to be directed by you? Time was treated like a corridor. You were always moving through it toward a better place. And because the better place was imagined, the present moment was never quite sufficient. Even calm was provisional. Even rest felt temporary. Because something was always next. When identity integrates, time loses this directional pressure. Not because goals disappear, but because time stops being a measure of worth. You no longer locate yourself inside time. You experience time through presence. And presence does not rush. You may notice that days feel fuller now, not busier, fuller. Moments are not being bypassed on the way to resolution. They complete themselves. A conversation ends without mental residue. A task finishes without replay. An emotion moves through without being extended by thought. This is not productivity, this is completion. And completion is what frees time. You stop trying to use time well, because time is no longer a resource to optimize. It is a medium through which life moves, and life knows how to pace itself. This is why urgency dissolves. Urgency was never about time. It was about fear of falling behind. When identity no longer depends on progress, there is nothing to fall behind from. So time relaxes. You may notice fewer mental jumps, less future scanning, less internal scheduling. Your attention returns to what is here because nothing is pulling it away. This is why patience becomes effortless, not because you practice it, but because nothing inside you is demanding speed. Speed was always a response to pressure. Remove pressure and speed recalibrates. You may also notice something counterintuitive. Things often happen faster, not because you rush, but because nothing is resisting sequence. Delays no longer feel personal. Intervals no longer feel like mistakes. They feel like part of movement. Neville spoke of living in the end, but the end was never a future moment. It was a state. And when the state is inhabited, time stops feeling like a barrier. This is when waiting changes quality. You don't wait with tension, you wait with availability. And availability keeps the system open. You no longer ask, when will this be done? You ask, what is happening now? And that question is grounding. This is how life begins to move on its own through time. Not because you surrendered to delay, but because you stopped forcing sequence. Sequence organizes itself when nothing is being pushed. You may notice that memory loosens its grip. You don't replay the past as much, not because it's resolved, but because it's complete. Completion removes residue. This is the quiet miracle of integrated time. Nothing is rushed. Nothing is late. Nothing needs to be fixed retroactively. Life unfolds, and you are present enough to meet it. Control was never about power, it was about safety. You didn't try to control life because you wanted dominance. You tried because you didn't know what would happen if you didn't. So you stayed involved. You adjusted outcomes. You anticipated reactions. You prepared for disruption. And all of this felt responsible, necessary. What if control was never strength, but a response to not feeling held by life? Trust, in contrast, is quiet. It doesn't announce itself. You don't decide to trust. You notice that you no longer intervene, that you let things land, that you allow moments to pass without correction. Trust arrives as absence, the absence of urgency, the absence of bracing, the absence of internal commentary. When trust replaces control, you stop gripping outcomes, not because you don't care, but because care no longer needs supervision. You trust that what is happening is not happening against you, and that assumption reorganizes everything. You may notice your body responds first. Muscles soften, breath deepens, the nervous system stops scanning. Because control was exhausting at the somatic level. Letting go of control is not a mental decision, it is a physical release. This is where the body finally catches up to the integration that already happened internally. You are no longer trying to steer life, you are riding it. And riding does not require force, it requires balance. Balance appears when effort drops. You stop leaning forward, you stop pulling back. You stand in the middle of experience, and from the middle, movement feels supported. Trust does not mean everything works out perfectly. It means you stop interpreting imperfection as a personal failure. You allow friction without panic. You allow uncertainty without collapse, because your safety is no longer tied to immediate resolution. This is why reactions soften. You don't overreact to surprises. You don't catastrophize delays. You don't interpret uncertainty as threat. Your system has learned that life does not need to be managed constantly. Neville spoke of assuming the feeling of the wish fulfilled. The feeling was never excitement, it was relief. Relief that nothing needed to be done to make life acceptable. From this relief, action becomes cleaner, time becomes spacious, the body becomes calm, and identity becomes transparent. There is no one left trying to make things happen. You may notice that trust does not feel dramatic, it feels ordinary. You wake up, you move through the day, you respond when needed, and somehow everything keeps moving. This ordinariness is the sign. Life does not need ceremony to function, it needs permission. You may also notice gratitude appear, not because things are amazing, but because they are working, because the system is no longer strained, because effort is no longer leaking energy. This is the moment where many people realize, I am not holding my life together. And instead of fear, they feel gratitude. Because being the one holding everything was never a privilege, it was a burden. Trust removes the burden, not by replacing it with faith, but by revealing that there was never anything to hold. Life was always carrying itself. Here is the realization that arrives not as insight, but as recognition. Life was always moving. Not because you managed it well, not because you held it together, not because you stayed alert. It was moving despite your effort, and often in spite of it. For a long time, you believed movement depended on you, that if you loosened your grip, things would stall. that if you stopped monitoring, life would drift into disorder. But now, looking back, you can see something clearly. Life never waited for your permission. It unfolded anyway. This realization doesn't create shame, it creates relief. Because it dissolves the quiet burden you carried without question. The burden of being responsible for keeping life in motion. What if the life you were trying to sustain was already sustaining you? You begin to notice how many things happened without your involvement. Moments that healed themselves. Situations that resolved naturally. Connections that shifted on their own. You were present, but not in control. And nothing collapsed. This is when gratitude becomes honest, not performative, not forced, but grounded in recognition. Recognition that life has an intelligence far beyond your planning, that movement does not need constant direction, that order does not require anxiety. You may notice that effort now feels unnecessary in places where it once felt essential. You no longer push yourself to feel alive. You don't force meaning. You don't chase alignment. Alignment is assumed. This is not resignation, it is cooperation. You cooperate with what is happening instead of competing with it, and cooperation feels like ease. You still act, you still choose, you still participate, but participation is no longer strained. You respond to what appears, you don't rehearse the rest. This is what it means to live a life that moves on its own, not a life without challenges, a life without resistance. You may notice that identity becomes lighter now. You don't define yourself through effort. You don't introduce yourself internally as someone working on life. You simply are. And being is not static. Being is dynamic presence. Neville spoke of the state fulfilled. The fulfilled state is not celebration. It is neutrality, the absence of inner conflict, the sense that nothing needs to be corrected before you can inhabit your life. From this state, joy becomes quieter, more stable, less dependent on outcomes. You enjoy things without gripping them. You move through difficulty without interpreting it as failure. This is when life starts to feel generous, not because it gives you more, but because it stops demanding effort to be lived. You may notice that the future no longer pulls at you. Plans still exist, but they don't dominate attention. You don't live towards something, you live with what is here. This does not shrink your life, it expands it. Because attention is no longer fragmented between now and later. Presence returns, and presence enriches everything it touches. If you follow this cluster from the beginning, you may recognize how quiet this ending is. No promise, no instruction, no next step to chase, because nothing needs to be added. This is not the end of movement. It is the end of interference. Life continues, but now it carries itself. If this way of living resonates, if you recognize this shift rather than learn it, the 21-day for Create Your Dream Life Challenge linked below exists not to create effort, but to stabilize this state. Explore it only if it feels natural. Nothing needs to be fixed. Staying here is not about subscribing to content. It's about staying close to a way of seeing life where effort is no longer the price of existence. If being here reminds you that life doesn't need to be pushed, then remaining connected is simply choosing alignment. Because from here on, life moves, and you move with it.